Part 3, Chapter 6 of By What Authority, by Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A departure. The months went by happily at Stanfield, and however ill went the fortunes of the church elsewhere, here at least were peace and prosperity. Most discouraging news indeed did reach them from time to time. The severe penalties now enacted against the practice of the Catholic religion were being enforced with great vigor, and the weak members of the body began to fail. 2 priests had apostatized at Chichester earlier in the year, one of them actually at the scaffold on Broyle Heath. And then in December there were 2 more recantations at Paul's Cross. Those Catholics, too, who threw up the faith generally became the most aggressive among the persecutors, to testify to their own consciences, as well to the Protestants, of the sincerity of their conversion. But in Stanfield the church flourished, and Anthony had the great happiness of receiving his first convert, in the person of Mr. Rowe, the young owner of a house called East Maskells, separated from Stanfield Place by a field path of under a mile in length, though the road round was over 2, and the comings and goings were frequent now between the 2 houses. Mr. Rowe was at present unmarried, and had his aunt to keep house for him, a tolerant old maiden lady who had conformed placidly to the Reformed religion 30 years before, and was now grown content with it. Several schismatics, too, as those Catholics were called who attended their parish church, had waxed bolder and given up their conformity to the establishment. So it was a happy and courageous flock that gathered Sunday by Sunday at Stanfield Place. Just before Christmas Anthony received a long and affectionate letter from James Maxwell, who was still at Douay. "The rector will still have me here," he wrote, "and shows me to the young men as if I were a kind of warrior, which is bad for pride. But then he humbles me again by telling me I am of more use here as an example than I should be in England, and that humbles me again. So I am content to stay. It is a humbling thing, too, to find young men who can tell me the history of my arms and legs better than I know it myself. But the truth is, I can never walk well again. Yet Laudetur Jesus Christus." Then James Maxwell wrote a little about his grief for Hubert, gave a little news of foreign movements among the Catholics, and finally ended as follows: "At last I understand who your friend was behind Bow Church, who stuttered and played the Catholic so well. It was our old servant Lackington who turned Protestant and entered Walsingham's service. I hear this all from one P. lately in the same affairs, but now turned to Christ his service instead, and who has entered here as a student. So beware of him. He has a pointed beard now, and a bald forehead. I hear, too, from the same source that he was on your track when you landed, but now thinks you to be in France. However, he knows of you, so I counsel you not to abide over long in one place. Perhaps you may go to Lancashire. That is like heaven itself for Catholics. Their zeal and piety there are beyond praise, but I hear they somewhat lack priests. God keep you always, my dear brother, and may the Queen of Heaven intercede for you. Pray for me." Soon after the New Year, Mary Corbet was able to get away from court and come down again to her friends for a month or 2 at Stanfield. During her stay they all had an adventure together at East Maskells. They had been out a long expedition into the woods one clear frosty day, and rode in just at sunset for an early supper with Mr. Rowe and his aunt. They had left their horses at the stable and come in round the back of the house, so that they missed the servant Miss Rowe had placed at the front door to warn them, and came straight into the winter parlour, where they found Miss Rowe in conversation with an ecclesiastic. There was no time to retreat, and Anthony in a moment more found himself being introduced to a minister he had met at Lambeth more than once, the Reverend Robert Carr, who had held the odd title of Archbishop's curate, and the position of minister in charge of the once collegiate church of All Saints, Maidstone, ever since the year '59. He had ridden up from Maidstone for supper and lodging, and was on his way to town. Anthony managed to interrupt Miss Rowe before she came to his assumed name Capel, and remarked rather loudly that he had met Mr. Carr before, who recognized him too, and greeted him by his real name. It was an uncomfortable situation, as Mr. Carr was quite unaware of the religion of 5 out of 6 of those present, and very soon began to give voice to his views on papistry. He was an oldish man by now, and of some importance in Maidstone, where he had been appointed jurat by the corporation, and was a very popular and influential man. "The voice of the people," he said in the midst of a conversation on the national feeling towards Spain, "that is what we must hearken to. Even sovereigns themselves must come to that some day. They must rule by obeying, as man does with God's laws in nature." "Would you say that, sir, of her Grace?" asked Mary Corbet meekly. "I should, madam, though I fear she has injured her power by her behaviour this year. It was her people who saved her. Hawkins, who is now ruined, as he says; my Lord Howard, who has paid from his own purse for the meat and drink of her Grace's soldiers, and those who fought with them, and not her Grace who saved them; or Leicester, now gone to his account, who sat at Tilbury and did the bowing and the prancing and the talking, while Hawkins and the rest did the fighting. No, madam, it is the voice of the people to which we must hearken." This was rather confused and dangerous talking, too, but here was plainly a man to be humoured. He looked round him with a suffused face, and the eye of a cock, and a little white plume on his forehead increased his appearance of pugnacity. "It is the same in religion," he said, when all preserved a deferential silence. "It is that that lies at the root of the papist errors. As you know very well," he went on, turning suddenly on Anthony, "our bishops do nothing to guide men's minds. They only seem to. They ride atop like the figure on a cock horse, but it is the legs beneath that do the work and the guiding too. Now that is right and good, and the Church of England will prosper so long as she goes like that. But if the bishops try to rule, they will find their mistake. Now the Popish Church is not like that. She holds that power comes from above, that the Pope guides the bishops the priests, and the priests the people. And the Holy Ghost the Pope. Is it not so, sir?" asked Mr. Buxton. Mr. Carr turned an eye on him. "So they hold, sir," he said after a pause. "They think then, sir, that the shepherds guide the sheep?" asked Anthony humbly. Mary Corbet gave a yelp of laughter, but when Mr. Carr looked at her, she was grave and deferential again. Miss Rowe looked entreatingly from face to face. The minister did not notice Anthony's remark, but swept on again on what was plainly his favourite theme, the infallibility of the people. It was a doctrine that was hardly held yet by any, but the next century was to see its gradual rise until it reached its climax in the Puritanism of the Stuart times. It was true, as Mr. Carr said, that Elizabeth had ruled by obeying, and that the people of England, encouraged by success in resisting foreign domination, were about to pass on to the second position of resisting any domination at all. Presently he pulled out of his pocket a small printed sheet, and was soon declaiming from it. It was not very much to the point, except as illustrating the national spirit, which he believed so divine. It was a ballad describing the tortures which the Spaniards had intended to inflict upon the heretic English, and began: "All you that list to look and see What profit comes from Spain, And what the Pope and Spaniards both Prepared for our gain, Then turn your eyes and lend your ears, And you shall hear and see What courteous minds, what gentle hearts They bear to thee and me." And it ended in the same spirit: "Be these the men that are so mild, Whom some so holy call? The Lord defend our noble Queen And country from them all." "There," the minister cried when he had done, "that is what the Papists are like. Trust me, I know them. I should know one in a moment if he ventured into this room, by his crafty face. But the Lord will defend his own Englishmen. Nay, he has done so. God blew, and they were scattered," he ended, quoting from the Armada medal. As the four rode home by pairs across the field path in the frosty moonlight, Mr. Buxton lamented to Anthony the effect of the Armada. "The national spirit is higher than ever," he said, "and it will be the death of Catholicism here for the present. Our country squires, I fear, faithful Catholics to this time, are beginning to wonder and question, when will our Catholic kings learn that Christ his kingdom is not of this world? Philip has smitten the faith in England with the weapon which he drew in its defence, as he thought." "I was once of that national spirit myself," said Anthony. "I remember you were," said Mr. Buxton, smiling, "and what grace has done to you, it may do to others." The spring went by, and in the week after Easter James' news about Lancashire was verified by a letter from a friend of Mr. Buxton's, a Mr. Norreys, the owner of one of the staunch Catholic houses, Speke Hall, on the bank of the Mersey. "Here," he wrote, "by the mercy of God, there is no lack of priests, though there be none to spare. My own chaplain says mass by dispensation thrice on Sunday; but on the moors the sheep look up and are not fed, and such patient sheep. I heard but last week of a church where the folk resort, priest or no, each Sunday to the number of 200, and are led by a lector in devotion, ending with an act of spiritual communion made all together. These damnable heresies of which the Apostle wrote have not poisoned the springs of sound doctrine. Some of us here know not yet of Elizabeth and her supremacy, or even of seven-wived Harry, his reformation. Send us then, dear friend, a priest, or at least the promise of one, lest we perish quite." Mr. Buxton had a sore struggle with himself over this letter, but at last he carried it to Anthony. "Read that," he said, and stood waiting. Anthony looked up when he had done. "I am your chaplain," he said, "but I am God's priest first." "Yes, dear lad," said his friend, "I feared you would say so; and I will say so to Norreys." And he left the room at once. And so at last it came to be arranged that Anthony should leave for Lancashire at the end of July, and that after his departure Stanfield should be served occasionally by the priest who lived on the outskirts of Tunbridge. But the daily mass would have to cease, and that was a sore trouble to Mr. Buxton. No definite decision could be made as to when Anthony could return. That must wait until he saw the needs of Lancashire; but he hoped to be able at least to pay a visit to Stanfield again in the spring of the following year. It was arranged also, of course, that Isabel should accompany her brother. They were both of large independent means, and could travel in some dignity, and her presence would be, under these circumstances, a protection as well as a comfort to Anthony. It would need very great sharpness to detect the seminary priest under Anthony's disguise, and amid the surroundings of his cavalcade of 4 or 5 armed servants, a French maid, and a distinguished-looking lady. Yet in spite of this, Mr. Buxton resolved to do his utmost to prevent Isabel from going to Lancashire. Partly, of course, he disliked the thought of the dangers and hardships that she was certain to encounter, but the real motive was that he had fallen very deeply in love with her. It was her exceptional serenity that seemed to him her greatest charm. Her movements, her face, her grey eyes, the very folds of her dress, seemed to breathe with it, and to one of Mr. Buxton's temperament such a presence was cool and sweet and strangely fascinating. It was now April, and he resolved to devote the next month or two to preparing her for his proposal, and he wrote frankly to Mary Corbet, telling her how matters stood, entreating her to come down for July and counsel him. Mary wrote back at once, rather briefly, promising to come, but not encouraging him greatly. "I would I could cheer you more," she wrote. "Of course I have not seen Isabel since January, but unless she has changed, I do not think she will marry you. I am writing plainly, you see, as you ask in your letter, but I can still say, God prosper you." As the spring went by and the summer came on, Isabel grew yet more silent. As the evenings began to lengthen out, she used to spend much time before and after supper in walking up and down the clipped lime avenue between the east end of the church and the great gates that looked over the meadows across which the stream and the field path ran towards East Maskells. Mr. Buxton would watch her sometimes from an upstairs window, himself unseen, and occasionally would go out and talk with her, but he found it harder than he used to get on to intimate relations, and he began to suspect that he had displeased her in some way, and that Mary Corbet was right. In the afternoon she and Anthony would generally ride out together, once or twice going round by Penshurst, and their host would torture himself by his own indecision as regards accompanying them, sometimes doing so, sometimes refraining, and regretting whichever he did. More and more he began to look forward to Mary's coming and the benefit of her advice, and at last, at the end of June, she came. Their first evening together was delightful for them all. She was happy at her escape from court, her host was happy at the prospect of her counsel, and all 4 were happy at being together again. They did not meet till supper, and even that was put off an hour because Mary had not come, and when she did arrive she was full of excitement. "I will tell you all at supper," she said to her host, whom she met in the hall. "Oh, how late I am!" and she whirled past him and upstairs without another word. "I will first give you the news in brief," she said, when Anthony had said grace and they were seated, all 4 of them as before, and the trumpet flourish was silent that had announced the approach of the venison. "Mutton's new chaplain, Dr. Bancroft, will be in trouble soon. He hath been saying favourable things for some of us poor papists, and hath rated the precisians soundly. Sir Francis Knollys is wroth with him, but that is no matter. Her Grace played at cards till 2 of the clock this morning, and that is why I am so desperate sleepy to night, for I had to sit up too, and that is a great matter. Drake and Norris, 'tis said, have whipped the Dons again at Corunna, and the Queen has sworn to pull my Lord Essex his ears for going with them and adventuring his precious self, and that is no matter at all, but will do him good. George Luttrell hath put up a coat of arms in his hall at Dunster, which is a great matter to him, but to none else. And I have robbed a highwayman this day in the beech woods this side of Groombridge." "Dear lady," said Mr. Buxton resignedly, as the others looked up startled, "you are too swift for our dull rustic ears. We will begin at the end, if you please. Is it true you have robbed an highwayman?" "It is perfectly true," she said, and unlatched a ruby brooch made heart shape from her dress. "There is the plunder." And she held it out for inspection. "Then tell us the tale," said Anthony. "It would be 5 of the clock," said Mary, "as we came through Groombridge, and then into the woods beyond. I had bidden my knaves ride on before with my woman. I came down into a dingle where there was a stream, and to tell the truth I had my head down and was a nodding, when my horse stopped, and I looked up of a sudden, and there was a man on a bay mare, with a mask to his mouth, a gay green suit, a brown beard turning grey, and this ruby brooch at his throat. And he had caught my bridle. I saw him start when I lifted my head, as if he were taken aback. I said nothing, but he led my horse off the road down among the trees, with a deep little thicket where none could see us. As we went I was thinking like a windmill, for I knew I had seen the little red brooch before. When we reached the little open space, I asked him what he wished with me. 'Your purse, madam,' said he. 'My woman hath it,' said I. 'Your jewels then, madam,' said he. 'My woman hath them,' said I, 'save this little paste buckle in my hat, to which you are welcome.' It was diamonds, you know, but I knew he would not know that. 'What a mistake,' I said, 'to stop the mistress and let the maid go free.' 'Nay,' he said, 'I am glad of it, for at least I will have a dance with the mistress, and I could not with the maid.' 'You are welcome to that,' I said, and I slipped off my horse to humour him, and even as I slipped off I knew who he was. For although many have red brooches and many brown beards turning grey, few have both together. But I said nothing, and there, will you believe it, we danced under the beech trees, like Phyllis and Corydon, or whoever they are that Sidney is always prating of, or like two fools, I would sooner say. Then when we had done I made him a curtsy. 'Now you must help me up,' said I, and he mounted me without a word, for he was a stoutish gallant and somewhat out of breath. And then what did the fool do but try to kiss me, and as he lifted his arm I snatched the brooch and put spur to my horse, and as we went up the bank I screamed at him, 'Claude, you fool, go home to your wife and take shame to yourself.' And when I was near the road I looked back, and he still stood there all agape." "And what was his name?" asked Anthony. "Nay, nay, I have mocked him enough, and I know 4 Claudes, so you need not try to guess." When supper was over, Mr. Buxton and Mary walked up and down the south part of the garden between the yews, while the other two sat just outside the hall window on a seat placed on a tiled terrace that ran round the house. "How I have longed for you to come, Mistress Mary," he said, "and counsel me of the matter we wrote about. Tell me what to do." Mary looked meditatively out to the strip of moon that was rising out to the east in the June sky. Then she looked tenderly at her friend. "I hate to pain you," she said, "but cannot you see that it is impossible? I may be wrong, but I think her heart is so given to our Saviour that there is no love of that sort left." "Ah, how can you say that?" he cried. "The love of the Saviour does not hinder earthly love; it purifies and transfigures it." "Yes," said Mary gravely, "it is often so; but the love of the true spouse of Christ is different. That leaves no room for an earthly bridegroom." Mr. Buxton was silent a moment or two. "You mean it is the love of the consecrated soul?" Mary bowed her head. "But I cannot be sure," she added. "Then what shall I do?" he said again, almost piteously; and Mary could see, even in the faint moonlight, that his pleasant face was all broken up and quivering. She laid her hand gently on his arm, and her rings flashed. "You must be very patient," she said, "very full of deference, and grave. You must not be ardent nor impetuous, but speak slowly and reverently to her, but at no great length. Be plain with her, do not look in her face, and do not show anxiety or despair or hope. You need not fear that your love will not be plain to her. Indeed, I think she knows it already." "Why, I have not," he began. "I know you have not spoken to her, but I saw that she only looked at you once during supper, and that was when your face was turned from her. She does not wish to look you in the eyes." "Ah, she hates me," he sighed. "Do not be foolish," said Mary. "She honors you, and loves you, and is grieved for your grief. But I do not think she will marry you." "And when shall I speak?" he asked. "You must wait. God will make the opportunity. In any case, you must not attempt to make it. That would terrify her." "And you will speak for me?" Mary smiled at him. "Dear friend," she said, "sometimes I think you do not know us at all. Do you not see that Isabel is greater than all that? What she knows, she knows. I could tell her nothing." The days passed on, the days of the last month of the Norrises' stay at Stanfield. Halfway through the month came the news of the Oxford executions. "Ah, listen to this!" cried Mr. Buxton, coming out to them one evening in the garden with a letter in his hand. "Humphrey Prichard," he read, "made a good end. He protested he was condemned for the Catholic faith, that he willingly died for it, that he was a Catholic. One of their ministers laughed at him, saying he was a poor ignorant fellow who knew not what it was to be a Catholic. 'I know very well,' said Humphrey, 'though I cannot say it in proper divinity language.' There is the religion for you," went on Mr. Buxton. "All meet there, wise and simple alike. There's no difference. No scholarship is needed for faith. 'I know what it is,' cried Humphrey, 'though I cannot explain it.'" The news came to Anthony just when he needed it. He felt he had done so little to teach his flock, now he was about to leave them; but if he had only done something to keep alive the fire of faith, he had not lost his time; and so he went about his spiritual affairs with new heart, encouraging the wavering whom he was to leave, warning the over confident, urging the hesitating, and saying good bye to them all. Isabel went with him sometimes, or sometimes walked or rode with Mary, and was silent for the most part in public. The master of the house himself did his affairs, and carried a heavier heart each day; and at last the opportunity came which Mary had predicted. He had come in one evening after a hot ride alone over to Tonbridge on some business with the priest there, and had dressed for supper immediately on coming in. As there was still nearly an hour before supper, he went out to walk up and down the same yew alley near the garden house where he had walked with Mary. Anthony and Isabel had returned a little later from East Maskells, and they too had dressed early. Isabel threw a lace shawl over her head, and betook herself too to the alley, and there she turned a corner and almost ran into her host. It was, as Mary had said, a God made opportunity. Neither time nor place could have been improved. If externals were of any value to this courtship, all that could have helped was there. The setting of the picture was perfect. A tall yew hedge ran down the northern side of the walk, cut, as Bacon recommended, not fantastically, but with some pretty pyramids. A strip of turf separated it from the walk, giving a sense both of privacy and space. On the south side ran flower beds in the turf, with yews and cypresses planted here and there, and an oak paling beyond. To the east lay the fair mount, again recommended by the same authority, but not so high, and with but one ascent. To the west the path darkened under trees, and over all rose up against the sunset sky the tall grotesque towers and vanes of the garden house. The flowers burned with that ember-like glow which may be seen on summer evenings, and poured out their scent. The air was sweet and cool, and white moths were beginning to poise and stir among the blossoms. The two actors on this scene, too, were not unworthy of it. His dark velvet and lace, with a glimmer of diamonds here and there, and his delicate bearded clean-cut face, a little tanned, thrown into relief by the spotless crisp ruff beneath, and above all his air of strength and refinement and self-possession, all combined to make him a formidable stormer of a girl's heart. And as he looked on her clear, almost luminous face and great eyes, shrined in the drooping lace shawl, through which a jewel or two in her black hair glimmered, her upright slender figure in its dark sheath, and the hand, white and cool, that held her shawl together over her breast, he had a pang of hope and despair at once, at the sudden sense of need of this splendid creature of God to be one with him, and reign with him over these fair possessions, and of hopelessness at the thought that anything so perfect could be accomplished in this imperfect world. He turned immediately and walked beside her, and they both knew, in the silence that followed, that the crisis had come. "Mistress Isabel," he said, still looking down as he spoke, and his voice sounded odd to her ears, "I wonder if you know what I would say to you." There came no sound from her but the rustle of her dress. "But I must say it," he went on, "follow what may. It is this: I love you dearly." Her walk faltered beside him, and it seemed as if she would stand still. "A moment," he said, and he lifted his white, restrained face. "I ask you to be patient with me. Perhaps I need not say that I have never said this to any woman before. But more, I have never even thought it. I do not know how to speak, nor what I should say, beyond this, that since I first met you at the door across there a year ago, you have taught me ever since what love means. And now I am come to you as to my dear mistress, with my lesson learnt." They were standing together now. He was still turned a little way from her, and dared not lift his eyes to her face again. Then of a sudden he felt her hand on his arm for a moment, and he looked up and saw her eyes all swimming with sorrow. "Dear friend," she said quite simply, "it is impossible. Ah, what can I say?" "Give me a moment more," he said, and they walked on slowly. "I know what presumption this is, but I will not spin phrases about that. Nor do I ask what is impossible, but I will only ask leave to teach you in my turn what love means." "Oh, that is the hardest of all to say," she said. "But I know already." He did not quite understand, and glanced at her a moment. "I once loved too," she whispered. He drew a sharp breath. "Forgive me," he said. "I forced that from you." "You are never anything but courteous and kind," she said, "and that makes this harder than all." They walked in silence half a dozen steps. "Have I distressed you?" he asked, glancing at her again. Then she looked full in his face, and her eyes were overflowing. "I am grieved for your sorrow," she said, "and at my own unworthiness. You know that?" "I know that you are now and always will be my dear mistress and queen." His voice broke altogether as he ended, and he bent and took her hand delicately in his own, as if it were royal, and kissed it. Then she gave a great sob, and slipped away through the opening in the clipped hedge, and he was left alone with the dusk and his sorrow. A week later Anthony and Isabel were saying good-bye to him in the early summer morning. The pack horses had started on before, and there were just the two saddle horses at the low oak door, with the servants behind. When Mr. Buxton had put Isabel into the saddle, he held her hand for a moment. Anthony was mounting behind. "Mistress Isabel," he whispered, "forgive me, but I find I cannot take your answer. You will remember that." She shook her head without speaking, but dared not even look into his eyes, though she turned her head as she rode out of the gates for a last look at the peaked gables and low windows of the house where she had been so happy. There was still the dark figure motionless against the pale oak door. "Oh, Anthony," she whispered brokenly, "our Lord asks very much." End of chapter 6. Part 3, Chapter 7 of By What Authority, by Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northern Religion. The northern counties were distinguished among all in England for their loyalty to the old faith, and this was owing, no doubt, to the characters of both the country and the inhabitants. It was difficult for the officers of justice to penetrate to the high moorland and deep ravines, and yet more difficult to prevail with the persons who lived there. 22 years before, the famous Lancashire League had been formed, under the encouragement of Dr. Allen, afterwards the Cardinal, whose members pledged themselves to determined recusancy, with the result that here and there church doors were closed and the Book of Common Prayer utterly refused. Owing partly to Bishop Downman's laxity towards the recusants, the principles of the League had retained their hold throughout the county ever since '68, when 10 obstinate Lancastrians had been haled before the Council, of whom one, the famous Sir John Southworth himself, suffered imprisonment more than once. Anthony and Isabel, then, found their life in the north very different to that which they had been living at Stanfield. Near the towns, of course, precaution was as necessary as anywhere else in England, but once they had passed up on to the higher moorlands, they were able to throw off all anxiety, as much as if the penal laws of England were not in force there. It was pleasant, too, to go, as they did, from great house to great house, and find the old pre-Reformation life of England in full vigour. The whole family present at mass so often as it was said, desirous of the sacraments, and thankful for the opportunities of grace that the arrival of the priest afforded. Isabel would often stay at such houses a week or two together, while Anthony made rounds into the valleys and to the moorland villages round about, and then the two would travel on together with their servants to the next village. Anthony's ecclesiastical outfit was very simple. Among Isabel's dresses lay a brocade vestment that might easily pass notice if the luggage was searched, and Anthony carried in his own luggage a little altar stone, a case with the holy oils, a tiny chalice and paten, singing cakes, and a thin vellum-bound missal and ritual in one volume, containing the order of mass, a few votive masses, and the usual benedictions for holy water, rue, and the like, and the occasional offices. In this manner they first visited many of the famous old Lancashire houses, some of which still stand: Borwick Hall, Hall o' the Wood, Lydiate Hall, Thurnham, Blainscow, where Campion had once been so nearly taken, and others, all of which were provided with secret hiding places for the escape of the priest, should a sudden alarm be raised. In none of them, however, did he find the same elaboration of device as at Stanfield Place. First, however, they went to Speke Hall, the home of Mr. Norreys, on the banks of the Mersey, a beautiful house of magpie architecture, and furnished with a remarkable underground passage to the shore of the Mersey, the scene of Richard Britain's escape. Here they received a very warm welcome. "It is as I wrote to Mr. Buxton," said his host on the evening of their arrival. "In many places in this country any religion other than the Catholic is unknown. The belief of the Protestant is as strange as that of the Turk, both utterly detested. I was in Cumberland a few months back. There, in more than one village, the old worship goes on as it has done since Christianity first came to this island. But I hope you will go up there, now that you have come so far. You would do a great work for Christ his Church." He told him, too, a number of stories of the zeal and constancy shown on behalf of the religion, of small squires who were completely ruined by the fines laid upon them, of old halls that were falling to pieces through the ruin brought upon their staunch owners, and above all of the priests that Lancashire had added to the roll of the martyrs, Anderton, Marsden, and Thompson among others, and of the joy shown when the glorious news of their victory over death reached the place where they had been born or where they had ministered. "At Preston," he said, "when the news of Mr. Greenaway's death reached them, they tolled the bells for sorrow. But his old mother ran from her house to the street when they had broken the news to her. 'Peal them, peal them,' she cried, 'for I have borne a martyr to God.'" He talked, too, of Campion, of his sermons on "The King Who Went a Journey" and "The Hail Mary," and told him of the escape at Blainscow Hall, where the servant girl, seeing the pursuivants at hand, pushed the Jesuit, with quick wit and courage, into the duck pond, so that he came out disguised indeed in green mud, and was mocked at by the very officers as a clumsy suitor of maidens. Anthony's heart warmed within him as he sat and listened to these tales of patience and gallantry. "I would lay down my life to serve such folk," he said, and Isabel looked with deep kindled eyes from the one to the other. They did not stay more than a day or two at Speke Hall, for, as Mr. Norreys said, the necessaries of salvation were to be had there already; but they moved on almost at once northwards, always arriving at some central point for Saturdays and Sundays, so that the Catholics round could come in for shrift and housel. In this manner they passed up through Lancashire, and pushed still northwards, hearing that a priest was sorely needed, through the corner of Westmoreland, up the Lake country, through into Cumberland itself. At Kendal, where they stayed 2 nights, Anthony received a message that determined him, after consultation with Isabel, to push on as far as Giddaw, and to make that the extreme limit of his journey. He sent the messenger, a wild looking north countryman, back with a verbal answer to that effect, and named a date when they would arrive. It was already dark, 2 weeks later, when they arrived at the point where the guide was to meet them, as they had lost their way more than once already. Here were a couple of men with torches waiting for them behind a rock, who had come down from the village, a mile farther on, to bring them up the difficult stony path that was the only means of access to it. The track went up a ravine, with a rock wall rising on their left, on which the light of the torches shone, and tumbled ground covered with heather, falling rapidly away on their right down to a gulf of darkness, whence they could hear the sound of the torrent far below. The path was uneven, with great stones here and there, and sharp corners in it, and as they went it was all they could do to keep their tired horses from stumbling, for a slip would have been dangerous under the circumstances. The men who led them said little, as it was impossible for a horse and a man to walk abreast; but Anthony was astonished to see again and again, as they turned a corner, another man with a torch and some weapon, a pike or a sword, start up and salute him, or sometimes a group with barefooted boys, and then attach themselves to the procession either before or behind, until in a short while there was an escort of some 30 or 40 accompanying the cavalcade. At last, as they turned a corner, the lighted windows of a belfry showed against the dark moor beyond, and in a moment more, as if there were a watcher set there to look out for the torches, a peal of 5 bells clashed out from the tower. Then, as they rose yet higher, the path took a sudden turn and a dip between 2 towering rocks, and the whole village lay beneath them, with lights in every window to welcome the priest, the first they had seen for 8 months, when the old Marian rector, the elder brother of the squire, had died. It was now late, so Anthony and Isabel were conducted immediately to the Hall, an old house immediately adjoining the churchyard, and here too the windows were blazing with welcome, and the tall squire, Mr. Brian, with his wife and children behind, was standing before the bright hall door at the top of the steps. The men and boys that had brought them so far, and were standing in the little court with their torches uplifted, now threw themselves on their knees to receive the priest's blessing before they went home. And Anthony blessed them and thanked them, and went indoors with his sister, strangely moved and uplifted. The 2 following days were full of hard work and delight for Anthony. He was to say mass at 6:30 next morning, and came out of the house a little after 6 o'clock. The sun was just rising to his right, over a shoulder of Skiddaw, which dominated the eastern horizon, and all round him, stretched against the sky in all directions, were the high purple moors in the strange dawn light. Immediately in front of him, not 30 yards away, stood the church with its tower, 2 aisles, and a chapel on a little promontory of rock which jutted out over the bed of the torrent along which he had climbed the night before; and to his left lay the straggling street of the village. All was perfectly still except for the dash of the stream over the rocks, but from 1 or 2 houses a thin skein of smoke was rising straight into the air. Anthony stood wrapped in delight, and drew long breaths of the cool morning air, laden with freshness and fragrant with the mellow scent of the heather and the autumnal smells. He was completely taken by surprise when he entered the church, for the first time since he could remember, he saw an English church in its true glory. It had been built for a priory church of Holm Coltram, but for some reason had never been used as that, and had become simply the parish church of the village. Across the centre and the northern aisle ran an elaborate screen, painted in rich colours, and the southern chapel, which ran eastwards out of the porch, was separated in a similar way from the rest of the church. Over this central screen was the great rood, with its attendant figures, exquisitely carved and painted. In every direction, as Anthony looked beyond the screens, gleamed rich windows, with figures and armorial bearings. Here and there tattered banners hung on the walls. St. Christopher stood on the north wall opposite the door, to guard from violence all who looked upon him day by day. A little painting of the Baptist hung on a pillar over against the font, and a vernicle by the pulpit, and all round the walls hung little pictures, that the poor and unlearned might read the story of redemption there. But the chief glory of all was the solemn high altar, with its riddels surmounted by taper-bearing gilded angels, with its brocade cloth and its painted halpus behind; and above it, before the rich window which smouldered against the dawn, hung the awful pyx, covered by the white silk cloth, but empty, waiting for the priest to come and bid the Shekinah of the Lord to brood there again over this gorgeous throne beneath, against the brilliant halo of the painted glass behind. Anthony knelt a moment and thanked God for bringing him here, and then passed up into the north aisle, where the image of the Mother of God presided, as she had done for 300 years, over her little altar against the wall. Anthony said his preparation and vested at the altar, and was astonished to find at least 30 people to hear mass. None, of course, made their communion, but Anthony, when he had ended, placed the body of the Lord once more in the hanging pyx, and lit the lamp before it. Then all day he sat in the north chapel, with the dash and loud thunder of the mountain stream entering through the opened panes of the east window, and the stained sunlight in gorgeous colours creeping across the red tiles at his feet, glowing and fading as the clouds moved over the sun, while the people came and were shriven. With the exception of an hour in the middle of the day, and half an hour for supper in the evening, he was incessantly occupied until 9 o'clock at night. From the upland dales all round they streamed in, at news of the priest; and those who had come from far and were fasting, he communicated at once from the reserved sacrament. At last Tired out, but intensely happy, he went back to the hall. But the next morning was yet more startling. Mass was at 8 o'clock, and by the time Anthony entered the church he found a congregation of nearly 200 souls. The village itself did not number above 70, but many came in from the country round, and some had stayed all night in the church porch. Then, too, he heard the north country singing in the old way. All the mass music was sung in 3 parts, except the unchanging melody of the Creed, which, like the tremendous and unchanging words themselves, at one time had united the whole of England. But what stirred Anthony more than all were the ancient hymns sung here and there during the service, some in Latin, which a few picked voices rendered, and some in English, to the old lilting tunes which were as much the growth of the north country as the heather itself. The Ave Verum Corpus was sung after the elevation, and Anthony felt that his heart would break for very joy as he bent before the body of his Lord, and the voices behind him rose and exulted up the aisles, the women's and children's voices soaring passionately up in the melody, the mellow men's voices establishing, as it seemed, these ecstatic pinnacles of song on mighty and immovable foundations. Vespers were said at 3 o'clock, after baptisms and more confessions, and Anthony was astonished at the number of folk who could answer the priest. After vespers he made a short sermon, and told the people something of what he had seen in the south, of the martyrdoms at Tyburn, and of the constancy of the confessors. "Be thou faithful unto death," he said, "so our Saviour bids us, and he gives us a promise too. I will give thee a crown of life. Beloved, some day the tide of heresy will creep up these valleys too, and it will bear many things with it, the scaffold and the gallows and the knife, maybe, and then our Lord will see which are his. Then will be the time that grace will triumph, that those who have used the sacraments with devotion, that have been careful and penitent with their sins, that have hungered for the bread of life, the Lord shall stand by them and save them, as he stood by Mr. Sherman on the rack, and Father Campion on the scaffold, and Mistress Ward, and many more, of whom I have not had time to tell you. He who bids us be faithful, himself will be faithful, and he who wore the crown of thorns will bestow upon us the crown of life." Then they sang a hymn to Our Lady, "Hail be thou, Mary, the Mother of Christ," and the old swaying tune rocked like a cradle, and the people looked up towards their mother's altar as they sang, their mother who had ruled them so sweetly and so long, and entreated her in their hearts, who stood by her Son's cross, to stand by theirs too should God ever call them to die upon one. The next day Mr. Brian took Anthony a long walk as soon as dinner was over, across the moors towards the north side of Skiddaw. Anthony found the old man a delightful and garrulous companion, full of tales of the countryside, historical, religious, naturalistic, and supernatural. As they stood on a little eminence and looked back to where the church tower pricked out of the deep crack in the moors where it stood, he told them the tale of the coming of the pursuivants. "They first troubled us in '72," he said. "They had not thought it worth while before to disturb themselves for one old man like my brother, who was like to die soon. But in April of that year they first sent up their men, but it was only a pair of pursuivants, for they knew nothing of the people. They came up, the poor men, to take my brother down to Cockermouth to answer on his religion to some bench of ministers that sat there. Well, they met him, in his cassock and square cap, coming out of the church, where he had just replaced the Most Holy Sacrament, after giving communion to a dying body. Are you the minister? Say they. I am the priest, if that is what ye mean, he answers back. He was a large man, like myself was my brother. Well, come, old man, say they, we must help you down to Cockermouth. Well, a few words passed, and the end was that he called out to Tim, who lived just against the church, and told them what was forward. Well, the pursuivants got back to Cockermouth with their lives, but not much else, and reported to the magistrates that the wild Irish themselves were little piminy maids compared to the folk they had visited that day. So there was a great to-do and a deal of talk, and in the next month they sent up 30 pikemen with an officer and a dozen pursuivants, and all to take one old priest and his brother. I'd been in Kendal in April when they first came, but they put it all down to me. Well, we were ready for them this time. The bells had been ringing to call in the folk since 6 o'clock in the morning, and by dinner time, when the soldiers were expected, there was a matter of 200 men, I should say, some with scythes and sickles, and some with staves or shepherd's crooks. The children had been sent down sooner to stone the men all the way up the path, and by the time they reached the churchyard gate there was not a man of them but had a cut or a bruise upon him. Then when they turned the corner, black with wrath, there were the lads gathered about the church porch, each with his weapon, and each white and silent, waiting for what should fall. Now you wonder where we were. We were in the church, my brother and I, for our people had put us there against our will to keep us safe, they said. But I was wroth when Alroyd and the rest pushed me through the door. However, there we were, locked in. I was up in one window, and my brother was in the belfry, as I thought, each trying to see what was forward. I saw the two crowds of them, silent and wrathful, with not 20 yards between them, and a few stones still sailing among the soldiers now and again. The pikes were being set in array, and our lads were opening out to let the scythes have free play, when on a sudden I heard the tinkle of a bell round the outside of the tower, and I climbed down from my place and up again to one of the west windows. There was a fearsome hush outside now, and I could see some of the soldiers in front were uneasy. They had their eyes off the lads and around the side of the tower. And then I saw little Dickie Alroyd in his surplice ringing a bell and bearing a candle, and behind him came my brother in a purple coat I had never set eyes on before, with his square cap and a great book, and his eyes shining out of his head, and his lips opening and mouthing out Latin. And then he stopped, laid the book reverently on a tombstone, lifted both hands, and brought them down with the fingers out, and his eyes larger than ever. I could see the soldiers were ready to break and scatter, for some were Catholics, no doubt, and many more feared the priest. And then on a sudden my brother caught the candle out of Dickie's hand, blew it out with a great puff, while Dickie rattled upon the bell, and then he dashed the smoking candle among the soldiers. The soldiers broke and fled like hares out of the churchyard, down the street, and down the path to Cockermouth. The officer tried to stay with them, but 'twas no use. The fear of the church was upon them, and her Grace herself could not have prevailed with them. Well, when they let us out, the lads were all a trembling too, for my brother's face, they said, was like the destroying angel, and I was somewhat queer myself, and I was astonished too, for he was kind-hearted, was my brother, and would not hurt a fly's body, much less damn his soul. And after all, the poor soldiers were not to blame, and 'Twas a queer cursing, I thought too, to be done like that, but maybe 'twas the new papal method. I went round to the north chapel, and there he was taking off his cope. 'Well,' he said to me, 'how did I do it?' 'Do it?' I said. 'Do it? Why, you've damned those poor lads' souls eternally. The hand of the Lord was with you,' I said. 'Damned them!' said he. 'Nonsense! 'Twas only your old herbal that I read at them, and the cope too. 'Twas inside out.'" Then the old man told Anthony other stories of his earlier life, how he had been educated at the university, and been at court in King Henry's reign and Queen Mary's, but that he had lost heart at Elizabeth's accession, and retired to his hills, where he could serve God according to his conscience, and study God's works too, for he was a keen naturalist. He told Anthony many stories about the deer and the herds of wild white hornless cattle that were now practically extinct on the hills, and of a curious breed of four-horned sheep, skulls of all of which species hung in his hall, and of the odd drinking horns that Anthony had admired the day before. There was one especially that he talked much of, a buffalo horn on three silver feet, fashioned like the legs of an armed man. Round the centre was a filleting inscribed, "Qui pugnat contra tres, perdet duos." And there was a cross pate on the horn, and two other inscriptions, "Noliti extollere cornu in altu," and "Qui bibat me adhuxiti." Mr. Brian told him it had been brought from Italy by his grandfather. They put up a quantity of grouse and several hares as they walked across the moor. One of the hares, which had a curious patch of white between his ears like a little nightcap, startled Mr. Brian so much that he exclaimed aloud, crossed himself, and stood a little pale, watching the hare's head as it bobbed and swerved among the heather. "I like it not," he said to Anthony, who inquired what was the matter. "Satan hath appeared under some such form to many in history. Joachimus Camerarius, who wrote De Natura Daemonum, tells, I think, a story of a hare followed by a fox that ran across the path of a young man who was riding on a horse, and who started in pursuit. Up and down hills and dales they went, and soon the fox was no longer there, and the hare grew larger and blacker as it went, and the young man presently saw that he was in a country that he knew not. It was all barren and desolate round him, and the sky grew dark. Then he spurred his horse more furiously, and he drew nearer and nearer to the great hare, that now skipped along like a stag before him. And then, as he put out his hand to cut the hare down, the creature sprang into the air and vanished, and the horse fell dead, and the man was found in his own meadow by his friends, in a swound, with his horse dead beside him, and trampled marks round and round the field, and the pug marks of what seemed like a great tiger beside him, where the beast had sprung into the air." When Mr. Brian found that Anthony was interested in such stories, he told him plenty of them, especially tales that seemed to join in a strange unity of life demons, beasts, and men. It was partly, no doubt, his studies as a naturalist that led him to insist upon points that united rather than divided the orders of creation; and he told him stories first from such writers as Michael Verdunus and Petrus Bergotus, who relate, among other marvels, how there are ointments by the use of which shepherds have been known to change themselves into wolves, and tear the sheep that they should have protected; and he quoted to him St. Augustine's own testimony to the belief that in Italy certain women were able to change themselves into heifers through the power of witchcraft. Finally he told him one or two tales of his own experience. "In the year '63," he said, "before my marriage, I was living alone in the Hall. I was a young man, and did my best to fear naught but deadly sin. I was coming back late from Threlkeld, round the south of Skiddaw that you see over there, and was going with a lantern, for it would be 10 o'clock at night, and the time of year was autumn. I was still a mile or two from the house, and was saying my beads as I came, for I hold that it is a great protection, when I heard a strange whistling noise, with a murmur in it, high up overhead in the night. It is the birds going south, I said to myself, for you know that great flocks fly by night when the cold begins to set in. But the sound grew louder and more distinct, and at last I could hear the sound as of words gabbled in a foreign tongue, and I knew they were no birds, though maybe they had wings like them. But I knew that a christened soul in grace has naught to fear from hell, so I crossed myself and said my beads and kept my eyes on the ground, and presently I saw my lights burning in the house, and heard the roar of the stream, and the gabbling above me ceased, as the sound of the running water began. But that night I woke again and again, and the night seemed hot and close each time, as if a storm was near. But there was no thunder. Each time I heard the roar of the stream below the house, and no more. At last, towards the morning, I set my window wide that looks towards the stream, and leaned out, and there beneath me, crowded against the wall of the house, as I could see in the growing light, was a great flock of sheep, with all their heads together towards the house, as close as a score of dogs could pack them, and they were all as still as death, and their backs were dripping wet, for they had come down the hills and swum the stream in order to be near a christened man, and away from what was abroad that night. My shepherds told me the same that day, that everywhere the sheep had come down to the houses as if terrified near to death, and at Keswick, whither I went the next market day, they told me the same tale, and that two men had each found a sheep that could not travel. One had a broken leg, and the other had been cast, but neither had another mark or wound or any disease upon him, but that both were lying dead upon Skiddaw, and the look in the dead eyes, they said, was fit to make a man forget his manhood. Anthony found the old man the most interesting companion possible, and he persuaded him to accompany him on several of the expeditions that he had to make to the hamlets and outlying cottages round, in his spiritual ministrations; and both he and Isabel were sincerely sorry when 2 Sundays had passed away, and they had to begin to move south again in their journeyings. And so the autumn passed and winter began, and Anthony was slowly moving down again, supplying the place of priests who had fallen sick or had died, visiting many almost inaccessible hamlets, and everywhere encouraging the waverers, and seeking the wanderers, and rejoicing over the courageous, and bringing opportunities of grace to many who longed for them. He met many other well-known priests from time to time, and took counsel with them, but did not have time to become very intimate with any of them, so great were the demands upon his services. In this manner he met John Colleton, the canonist, who had returned from his banishment in '87, but found him a little dull and melancholy, though his devotion was beyond praise. He met, too, the Jesuit fathers, Edward Oldcorn and Richard Holtby, the former of whom had lately come from Hindlip. He spent Christmas near Cartmel in Furness, and after the new year had opened, crossed the Ken once more near Beetham, and began to return slowly down the coast. Everywhere he was deeply touched by the devotion of the people, who, in spite of long months without a priest, had yet clung to the observance of their religion so far as was possible, and now welcomed him like an angel of God; and he had the great happiness, too, of reconciling some who, yielding to loneliness and pressure, had conformed to the establishment. In these latter cases he was almost startled by the depth of Catholic convictions that had survived. "I never believed it, father," said a young squire to him near Garstang. "I knew that it was but a human invention, and not the gospel that my fathers held, and the Christ our Saviour brought on earth. But I lost heart, for that no priest came near us, and I had not had the sacraments for nearly 2 years, and I thought that it were better to have some religion than none at all. So at last I went to church. But there's no need to talk to me, father, now I have made my confession, for I know with my whole soul that the Catholic religion is the true one, and I have known it all the while, and I thank God and his blessed Mother, and you, father, too, for helping me to say so again and to come back to grace." At last, at the beginning of March, Anthony and Isabel found themselves back again at Speke Hall, warmly welcomed by Mr. Norreys. "You have done a good work for the Church, Mr. Capell," said his host, "and God will reward you and thank you for it himself, for we cannot." "And I thank God," said Anthony, "for the encouragement to faith that the sight of the faithful North has given to me, and pray him that I may carry something of her spirit back with me to the South." There were letters waiting for him at Speke Hall, one from Mr. Buxton urging them to come back, at least for the present, to Stanfield Place, so soon as the winter work in the north was over, and another from the rector of the college at Douai to the same effect. There was also one more, written from a little parish in Kent, from a Catholic lady who was altogether a stranger to him, but who plainly knew all about him, entreating him to call at her house when he was in the South again. Her husband, she said, had met him once at Stanfield, and had been strongly attracted by him to the Catholic Church, and she believed that if Anthony would but pay them a visit, her husband's conversion would be brought about. Anthony could not remember the man's name, but Isabel thought that she did remember some such person at a small private conference that Anthony had given in Mr. Buxton's house, for the benefit of Catholics and those who were being drawn towards the religion. The lady, too, gave him instructions as to how he should come from London to her house, recommending him to cross the Thames at a certain spot that she described near Greenhithe, and to come on southwards along a route that she marked for him, to the parish of Stanstead, where she lived. This then was soon arranged, and after letters had been sent off announcing Anthony's movements, he left Speke Hall with Isabel about a fortnight later. Chapter 8 of By What Authority, by Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In Stanstead Woods. On the first day of June, Anthony and Isabel, with their 3 armed servants and the French maid behind them, were riding down through Thurrock to the north bank of the Thames, opposite Greenhithe. As they went, Anthony pulled out and studied the letter and the little map that Mrs. Kirke had sent to guide them. "On the right hand side," she wrote, "when you come to the ferry, stands a little inn, the Sloop, among the trees, with a yard behind it. Mr. Bender, the host, is one of us, and he will get your horses on board, and do all things to forward you without attracting attention. Give him some sign that he may know you for a Catholic, and when you are alone with him, tell him where you are bound." There were 1 or 2 houses standing near the bank as they rode down the lane that led to the river, but they had little difficulty in identifying the Sloop, and presently they rode into the yard, and leaving their horses with the servants, stepped round into the little smoky front room of the inn. A man, dressed somewhat like a sailor, was sitting behind a table, who looked up with a dull kind of expectancy, and whom Anthony took as the host, and, in order to identify him and show who he himself was, he took up a little cake of bread that was lying on a platter on the table, and broke it as if he would eat. This was one of Father Persons' devices, and was used among Catholics to signify their religion when they were with strangers, since it was an action that could rouse no suspicion among others. The man looked in an unintelligent way at Anthony, who turned away and rapped upon the door, and as a large, heavily built man came out, broke it again and put a piece into his mouth. The man lifted his eyebrows slightly and just smiled, and Anthony knew he had found his friend. "Come this way, sir," he said, "and your good lady too." They followed him into the inner room of the house, a kind of little kitchen, with a fire burning and a pot over it, and one or two barrels of drink against the wall. A woman was stirring the pot, for it was near dinner time, and turned round as the strangers came in. It was plainly an inn that was of the poorest kind, and that was used almost entirely by watermen or by travellers who were on their way to cross the ferry. "The less said the better," said the man, when he had shut the door. "How can I serve you, sir?" "We wish to take our horses and ourselves across to Greenhithe," said Anthony, "and Mrs. Kirke, to whom we are going, bade us make ourselves known to you." The man nodded and smiled. "Yes, sir, that can be managed directly. The ferry is at the other bank now, sir, and I will call it across. Shall we say in half an hour, sir? And meanwhile, will you and your lady take something?" Anthony accepted gladly, as the time was getting on, and ordered dinner for the servants too in the outer room. As the landlord was going to the door, he stopped him. "Who is that man in the other room?" he asked. The landlord gave a glance at the door, and came back towards Anthony. "To tell the truth, sir, I do not know. He is a sailor by appearance, and he knows the talk; but none of the watermen know him, and he seems to do nothing. However, sir, there's no harm in him that I can see." Anthony told him that he had broken the bread before him, thinking he was the landlord. The real landlord smiled broadly. "Thank God I am somewhat more of a man than that." For the sailor was lean and sun dried. Then once more Mr. Bender went to the door to call the servants in. "Why, the man's gone," he said, and disappeared. Then they heard his voice again. "But he's left his groat behind him for his drink, so all's well." And presently his voice was heard singing as he got the table ready for the servants. In a little more than half an hour the party and the horses were safely on the broad barge-like ferry, and Mr. Bender was bowing on the bank and wishing them a prosperous journey, as they began to move out on to the wide river towards the chalk cliffs and red roofs of Greenhithe that nestled among the mass of trees on the opposite bank. In less than 10 minutes they were at the pier, and after a little struggle to get the horses to land, they were mounted and riding up the straight little street that led up to the higher ground. Just before they turned the corner, they heard far away across the river the horn blown to summon the ferry boat once more. There were two routes from Greenhithe to Stanstead, the one to the right through Longfield and Ash, the other to the left through Southfleet and Nurstead. There was very little to choose between them as regards distance, and Mrs. Kirke had drawn a careful sketch map with a few notes as to the characteristics of each route. There were besides, particularly through the thick woods about Stanstead itself, innumerable cross paths intersecting one another in all directions. The travellers had decided at the inn to take the road through Longfield, since in spite of other disadvantages it was the less frequented of the two, and they were anxious above all things to avoid attention. Their horses were tired, and as they had plenty of time before them, they proposed to go at a foot's pace all the way, and to take between 2 and 3 hours to cover the 9 or 10 miles between Greenhithe and Stanstead. It was a hot afternoon as they passed through Fawkham, and it was delightful to pass from the white road in under the thick arching trees just beyond the village. There everything was cool shadow, the insects sang in the air about them, an early rabbit or two cantered across the road and disappeared into the thick undergrowth. Once the song of the birds about them suddenly ceased, and through an opening in the green rustling vault overhead they saw a cruel shape with motionless wings glide steadily across. They did not talk much, but let the reins lie loose, and enjoyed the cool shadow and the green lights and the fragrant mellow scents of the woods about them, while their horses slouched along on the turf, switching their tails, and even stopping sometimes for a second in a kind of desperate greediness to snatch a green juicy mouthful at the side. Isabel was thinking of Stanfield, and wondering how the situation would adjust itself. Mary Corbet would be there, she knew, to meet them, and it was a comfort to think she could consult her. But what, she asked herself, would be her relations with the master of the house? Suddenly Anthony's horse stepped off the turf on the opposite side of the road and began to come towards her, and she moved her beast a little to let him come on the turf beside her. "Isabel," said Anthony, "tell me if you hear anything." She looked at him, suddenly startled. "No, no," he said, "there is nothing to fear. It is probably my fancy. But listen, and tell me." She listened intently. There was the creaking of her own saddle, the soft footfalls of the horses, the hum of the summer woods, and the sound of the servants' horses behind. "No," she said, "there is nothing beyond there," he said suddenly. "Now do you hear it?" Then she heard plainly the sound either of a man running or of a horse walking, somewhere behind them. "Yes," she said, "I hear something. But what of it?" "It is the third time I have heard it," he said, "once in the woods behind Longfield, and once just before the little village with the steepled church." The sound had ceased again. "It is someone who has come nearly all the way from Greenhithe behind us. Perhaps they are not following, but again—" "They?" she said. "There is only one." "There are three," he answered, "at least. The other two are on the turf at the side. But just before the village I heard all three of them, or rather certainly more than two, when they were between those two walls where there was no turf." Isabel was staring at him with great frightened eyes. He smiled back at her tranquilly. "Ah, Isabel," he said, "there is nothing really to fear in any case." "What shall you do?" she asked, making a great effort to control herself. "I think we must find out first of all whether they are after us. We must certainly not ride straight to the Manor Lodge if it is so." Then he explained his plan. "See here," he said, holding the map before her as he rode, "we shall come to Fawkham Green in 5 minutes. Then our proper road leads straight on to Ash, but we will take the right instead, toward Eynsford. Meanwhile I will leave Robert here, hidden by the side of the road, to see who these men are, and what they look like, and we will ride on slowly. When they have passed, he will come out and take the road we should have taken, and he then will turn off to the right too before he reaches Ash; and by trotting he will easily come up with us at this corner," and he pointed to it on the map, "and so he will tell us what kind of men they are, and they will never know that they have been spied upon, for by this plan he will not have to pass them. Is that a good plot?" And he smiled at her. Isabel assented, feeling dazed and overwhelmed. She could hardly bring her thoughts to a focus, for the fears that had hovered about her ever since they had left Lancashire and come down to the treacherous south had now darted upon her, tearing her heart with terror, and blinding her eyes, and bewildering her with the beating of their wings. Anthony quietly called up Robert and explained the plan. He was a lad of a Catholic family at Great Keynes, perfectly fearless, and perfectly devoted to the Church and to the priest he served. He nodded his head briskly with approval as the plan was explained. "Of course it may all be nothing," ended Anthony, "and then you will think me a poor fool?" The lad grinned cheerfully. "No, sir," he said. All this while they had been riding slowly on together, and now the wood showed signs of coming to an end, so Anthony told the groom to ride 50 yards into the undergrowth at once, to bandage his horse's eyes, and to tie him to a tree, and then to creep back himself near the road so as to see without being seen. The men who seemed to be following were at least half a mile behind, so he would have plenty of time. Then they all rode on together again, leaving Robert to find his way into the wood. As they went, Isabel began to question her brother, and Anthony gave her his views. "They have not come up with us because they know we are 4 men to 3, if, as I think, they are not more than 3. That is one reason; and another is that they love to track us home before they take us, and thus take our hosts too as priests' harbourers. Now plainly these men do not know where we are bound, or they would not follow us so closely. Best of all, too, they love to catch us at mass, for then they have no trouble in proving their case. I think then that they will not try to take us till we reach the Manor Lodge, and we must do our best to shake them off before that. Now the plot I have thought of is this: that, should it prove, as I think it will, we should ride slower than ever, as if our horses were weary, down the road along which Robert will have come after he has joined us, and turn down as if to go to Kingsdown; and when we have gone half a mile, and are well round that sharp corner, double back to it, and hide all in the wood at the side. They will follow our tracks, and there are no houses at which they can ask, and there seem no travellers either on these by roads. And when they have passed us, we double back at the gallop, and down the next turning, which will bring us in a couple of miles to Stanstead. There is a maze of roads thereabouts, and it will be hard if we do not shake them off, for there is not a house marked upon the map at which they can ask after us." Isabel did her utmost to understand, but the horror of the pursuit had overwhelmed her. The quiet woods into which they had passed again after leaving Fawkham Green now seemed full of menace. The rough road with the deep powdery ruts, and the grass and fir needles at the side, no longer seemed a pleasant path leading home, but a treacherous device to lead them deeper into danger. The creatures round them, the rabbits, the pigeons that flapped suddenly out of all the tall trees, the tits that fluttered on and chirped and fluttered again, all seemed united against Anthony in some dreadful league. Anthony himself felt all his powers of observation and device quickened and established. He had lived so long in the expectation of a time like this, and had rehearsed and mastered the emotions of terror and suspense so often, that he was ready to meet them; and gradually his entire self-control, and the unmoved tones of his voice, and his serene, alert face, prevailed upon Isabel; and by the time that they slowly turned the last curve, and saw Robert on his black horse waiting for them at the corner, her sense of terror and bewilderment had passed, her heart had ceased that sick thumping, and she too was tranquil and capable. Robert wheeled his horse and rode beside Anthony round the sharp corner to the left up the road along which he had trotted just now. "There are 3 of them, sir," he said in an even, businesslike voice. "One of them, sir, on a brown mare; but I couldn't see aught of him, sir; he was on the far side of the track. The second is like a groom on a grey horse; and the third is dressed like a sailor, sir, on a brown horse." "A sailor?" said Anthony. "A lean man, and sunburnt, with a whistle?" "I did not see the whistle, sir; but he is as you say." This made it certain that it was the man they had seen in the inn opposite Greenhithe; and also practically certain that he was a spy; for nothing that Anthony had done could have roused his suspicions, except the breaking of the bread; and that would only be known to one who was deep in the counsels of the Catholics. All this made the pursuit the more formidable. So Anthony meditated, and presently, calling up the servants behind, explained the situation and his plan. The French maid showed signs of hysteria, and Isabel had to take her aside and quiet her, while the men consulted. Then it was arranged, and the servants presently dropped behind again a few yards, though the maid still rode with Isabel. Then they came to the road on the right that would have led them to Kingsdown, and down this they turned. As they went, Anthony kept a good look out for a place to turn aside, and 100 yards from the turning saw what he wanted. On the left-hand side a little path led into the wood. It was overgrown with brambles, and looked as if it were now disused. Anthony gave the word, and turned his horse down the entrance, and was followed in single file by the others. There were thick trees about them on every side, and what was far more important, the road they had left at this point ran higher than usual, and was hard and dry, so the horses' hoofs as they turned off left no mark that would be noticed. After riding 30 or 40 yards, Anthony stopped, turned his horse again, and forced him through the hazels with some difficulty, and the others again followed in silence through the passage he had made. Presently Anthony stopped. The branches that had swished their faces as they rode through now seemed a little higher, and it was possible to sit here on horseback without any great discomfort. "I must see them myself," he whispered to Isabel, and slipped off his horse, giving the bridle to Robert. "Oh, mon Dieu!" moaned the maid. "Mon Dieu! Ne partez pas!" Anthony looked at her severely. "You must be quiet and brave," he said sternly. "You are a Catholic too. Pray instead of crying." Then Isabel saw him slip noiselessly toward the road, which was some 50 yards away through the thick growth. It was now a breathless afternoon. High overhead the sun blazed in a cloudless sky, but down here all was cool green shadow. There was not a sound to be heard from the woods beyond the mellow hum of the flies. Anthony's faint rustlings had ceased. Now and then a saddle creaked, or a horse blew out his nostrils or tossed his head. One of the men wound his handkerchief silently round a piece of his horse's head harness that jingled a little. The maid drew a soft sobbing breath now and then, but she dared not speak after the priest's rebuke. Then suddenly there came another sound to Isabel's ears. She could not distinguish at first what it was, but it grew nearer, and presently resolved itself into the fumbling noise of several horses' feet walking together. Twice or three times a stirrup chinked. Once she heard a muffled cough, but no word was spoken. Nearer and nearer it came, until she could not believe that it was not within 5 yards of her. Her heart began again that sick thumping. A fly that she had brushed away again and again now crawled unheeded over her face, and even on her white parted lips. But a sob of fear from the maid recalled her, and she turned a sharp look of warning on her. Then the fumbling noise began to die away. The men were passing. There was something in their silence that was more terrible than all else. It reminded her of hounds running on a hot scent. Then at last there was silence, then gentle rustlings again over last year's leaves, and Anthony came back through the hazels. He nodded at her sharply. "Now quickly," he said, and took his horse by the bridle and began to lead him out again the way they had come. At the entrance he looked out first. The road was empty and silent. Then he led his horse clear and mounted as the others came out one by one in single file. "Now follow close and watch my hand," he said, and he put his horse to a quick walk on the soft wayside turf. As the distance widened between them and the men who were now riding away from them, the walk became a trot, and then quickly a canter, as the danger of the sound being carried to their pursuers decreased. It seemed to Isabel like some breathless dream as she followed Anthony's back, watching the motions of his hand as he signed in which direction he was going to turn next. What was happening, she half wondered to herself, that she should be riding like this on a spent horse, as if in some dreadful game, turning abruptly down lanes and rides, out across the high road, and down again another turn, with the breathing and creaking and jingling of others behind her. Years ago the two had played Follow my leader on horseback in the woods above Great Keynes. She remembered this now, and a flood of memories poured across her mind and diluted the bitterness of this shocking reality. Dear God, what a game! Anthony steered with skill and decision. He had been studying the map with great attention, and even now carried it loose in his hand and glanced at it from time to time. Above all else he wished to avoid passing a house, for fear that the searchers might afterwards inquire at it, and he succeeded perfectly in this, though once or twice he was obliged to retrace his steps. There was little danger, he knew now, of the noise of the horses' feet being any guide to those who were searching, for the high tableland on which they rode was a labyrinth of lanes and rides, and the trees too served to echo and confuse the noise they could not altogether avoid making. Twice they passed travellers, one a farmer on an old grey horse, who stared at this strange hurrying party, and once a pedlar laden with his pack, who trudged past, head down. Isabel's horse was beginning to strain and pant, and she herself to grow giddy with heat and weariness, when she saw through the trees an old farmhouse with latticed windows and a great external chimney, standing in a square of cultivated ground, and in a moment more the path they were following turned a corner, and the party drew up at the back of the house. At the noise of the horses' footsteps a door at the back had opened, and a woman's face looked out and drew back again, and presently from the front Mrs. Kirke came quickly round. She was tall and slender and middle aged, with a somewhat anxious face, but a look of great relief came over it as she saw Anthony. "Thank God you are come," she said. "I feared something had happened." Anthony explained the circumstances in a few words. "I will ride on gladly, madam, if you think right; but I will ask you in any case to take my sister in." "Why, how can you say that?" she said. "I am a Catholic. Come in, father. But I fear there is but poor accommodation for the servants." "And the horses?" asked Anthony. "The barn at the back is got ready for them," she said. "Perhaps it would be well to take them there at once." She called a woman and sent her to show the men where to stable the horses, while Anthony and Isabel and the maid dismounted and came in with her to the house. There they talked over the situation and what was best to be done. Her husband had ridden over to Wrotham, and she expected him back for supper. Nothing then could be finally settled till he came. In the meantime the Manor Lodge was probably the safest place in all the woods, Mrs. Kirke declared. The nearest house was half a mile away, and that was the Rectory, and the Rector himself was a personal friend and favourable to Catholics. The Manor Lodge too stood well off the road to Wrotham, and not 5 strangers appeared there in the year. 50 men might hunt the woods for a month and not find it. In fact, Mr. Kirke had taken the house on account of its privacy, for he was weary, his wife said, of paying her fines for recusancy, and still more unwilling to pay his own when that happy necessity should arrive, for he had now practically made up his mind to be a Catholic, and only needed a little instruction before being received. "He is a good man, father," she said to Anthony, "and will make a good Catholic." Then she explained about the accommodation. Isabel and the maid would have to sleep together in the spare room, and Anthony would have the little dressing room opening out of it, and the men, she feared, would have to shake down as well as they could in the loft over the stable in the barn. At 7 o'clock Mr. Kirke arrived, and when the situation had been explained to him, he acquiesced in the plan. He seemed confident that there was but little danger, and he and Anthony were soon deep in theological talk. Anthony found him excellently instructed already. He had, in fact, even prepared for his confession. His wife had taught him well, and it was the prospect of this one good opportunity of being reconciled to the Church that had precipitated matters and decided him to take the step. He was a delightful companion too, intelligent, courageous, humorous, and modest, and Anthony thought his own labour and danger well repaid when a little after midnight he heard his confession and received him into the church. It was impossible for Mr. Kirke to receive communion as he had wished, for there were wanting some of the necessaries for saying mass. So he promised to ride across to Stanfield in a week or so, stay the night, and communicate in the morning. Then early the next morning a council was held as to the best way for the party to leave for Stanfield. The men were called up and their opinions asked, and gradually, step by step, a plan was evolved. The first requirement was that, if possible, the party should not be recognizable; the second, that they should keep together for mutual protection, for to separate would very possibly mean the apprehension of some one of them. The third was that they should avoid, so far as was possible, villages and houses and frequented roads. Then the first practical suggestion was made by Isabel that the maid should be left behind, and that Mr. Kirke should bring her on with him to Stanfield when he came a week later. This he eagerly accepted, and further offered to keep all the luggage they could spare, take charge of the men's liveries, and lend them old garments and hats of his own, to one a cloak and to another a doublet. In this way, he said, it would appear to be a pleasure party rather than one of travellers; and should they be followed, this would serve to cover their traces. The travelling by unfrequented roads was more difficult, for that in itself might attract attention should they actually meet anyone. Anthony, who had been thinking in silence a moment or two, now broke in. "Have you any hawks, Mr. Kirke?" he asked. "Only one old peregrine," he said, "past sport." "She will do," said Anthony. "And can you borrow another?" "There is a merlin at the Rectory," said Mr. Kirke. Then Anthony explained his plan, that they should pose as a hawking party. Isabel and Robert should each carry a hawk, while he himself would carry on his wrist an empty leash and hood, as if a hawk had escaped; that they should then all ride together over the open country, avoiding every road; and that if they should see anyone on the way, they should inquire whether he had seen an escaped falcon, or heard the tinkle of the bells; and this would enable them to ask the way, should it be necessary, without arousing suspicion. This plan was accepted, and the maid was informed, to her great relief, that she might remain behind for a week or so, and then return with Mr. Kirke after the searchers had left the woods. It was a 20-mile ride to Stanfield, and it was thought safer on the whole not to remain any longer where they were, as it was impossible to know whether a shrewd man might not, with the help of a little luck, stumble upon the house. So when dinner was over, and the servants had changed into Mr. Kirke's old suits, and the merlin had been borrowed from the Rectory for a week's hawking, the horses were brought round and the party mounted. Mr. Kirke and Anthony had spent a long morning together discussing the route, and it had been decided that it would be best to keep along the high ridge due west until they were a little beyond Kemsing, which they would be able to see below them in the valley, and then to strike across between that village and Otford, and keeping almost due south, ride up through Knowle Park, then straight down on the other side into the Weald, and so past Tunbridge home. Mr. Kirke himself insisted on accompanying them on his cob until he had seen them clear of the woods on the high ground. Both he and his wife were full of gratitude to Anthony for the risk and trouble he had undergone, and did their utmost to provide them with all that was necessary for their disguise. At last, about 2:00, the 5 men and Isabel rode out of the little yard at the back of the manor lodge, and plunged into the woods again. The afternoon hush rested on the country as they followed Mr. Kirke along a narrow, seldom used path that led almost straight to the point where it was decided that they should strike south. In half a dozen places it cut across lanes, and once across the great high road from Farningham to Wrotham. As they drew near this, Mr. Kirke, who was riding in front, checked them. "I will go first," he said, "and see if there is danger." In a minute he returned. "There is a man about 100 yards up the road, asleep on a bank; and there is a cart coming up from Wrotham. That is all I can see. Perhaps we had better wait till the cart is gone." "And what is the man like?" asked Anthony. "He is a beggar, I should say, but has his hat over his eyes." They waited till the cart had passed. Anthony dismounted and went to the entrance of the path and peered out at the man. He was lying, as Mr. Kirke had said, with his hat over his eyes, perfectly still. Anthony examined him a minute or two. He was in tattered clothes, and a great stick and a bundle lay beside him. "It is a vagabond," he said. "We can go on." The whole party crossed the road, pushing on towards the edge of the high downs over Kemsing, and presently came to the Ightham road, where it began to run steeply downhill. Here too Mr. Kirke looked this way and that, but no one was in sight, and then the whole party crossed. They kept inside the edge of the wood all the way along the downs for another mile or so, with the rich sunlit valley seen in glimpses through the trees here and there, and the Pilgrim's Way lying like a white ribbon a couple of 100 feet below them, until at last Kemsing Church, with St. Edith's chantry at the side, lay below and behind them, and they came out on to the edge of a great scoop in the hill, like a theatre, and the blue woods and hills of Surrey showed opposite beyond Otford and Braested. Here they stopped, a little back from the edge, and Mr. Kirke gave them their last instructions, pointing out Seal across the valley, which they must leave on their left, skirting the meadows to the west of the church, and passing up towards Knowle beyond. "Let the sun be a little on your right," he said, "all the way, and you will strike the country above Tonbridge." Then they said good bye to one another. Mr. Kirke kissed the priest's hand in gratitude for what he had done for him, and then turned back along the edge of the downs, riding this time outside the woods, while the party led their horses carefully down the steep slope, across the Pilgrim's Way, and then struck straight out over the meadows to Seal. Their plan seemed supremely successful. They met a few countrymen and lads at their work, who looked a little astonished at first at this great party riding across country, but more satisfied when Anthony had inquired of them whether they had seen a falcon or heard his bells. No, they had not, they said, and went on with their curiosity satisfied. Once, as they were passing down through a wood on to the Weald, Isabel, who had turned in her saddle and was looking back, gave a low cry of alarm. "Ah, the man, the man!" she said. The others turned quickly, but there was nothing to be seen but the long straight ride stretching up to against the sky line 300 or 400 yards behind them. Isabel said she thought she saw a rider pass across this little opening at the end, framed in leaves. But there were stags everywhere in the woods here, and it would have been easy to mistake one for the other at that distance, and with such a momentary glance. Once again near Tonbridge they had a fright. They had followed up a grass ride into a copse, thinking it would bring them out somewhere, but it led only to the brink of a deep little stream, where the plank bridge had been removed, so they were obliged to retrace their steps. As they re-emerged into the field from the copse, a large, heavily built man on a brown mare almost rode into them. He was out of breath, and his horse seemed distressed. Anthony, as usual, immediately asked if he had seen or heard anything of a falcon. "No, indeed, gentlemen," he said. "And have you seen aught of a bitch who bolted after a hare some half mile back? A greyhound I should be loath to lose." They had not, and said so, and the man, still panting and mopping his head, thanked them, and asked whether he could be of any service in directing them if they were strange to the country. But they thought it better not to give him any hint of where they were going, so he rode off presently up the slope across their route and disappeared, whistling for his dog. And so at last, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they saw the church spire of Stanfield above them on the hill, and knew that they were near the end of their troubles. Another 100 yards, and there were the roofs of the old house, and the great iron gates, and the vanes of the garden house seen over the clipped limes. And then Mary Corbet and Mr. Buxton hurrying in from the garden as they came through the low oak door into the dear tapestried hall. End of chapter 8.